Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we have with us Shefali Jha, Assistant Professor, Humanities and Social Sciences at Dhirubhai Ambani University in Gandhinagar. And Shefali, firstly, congratulations on recently winning the NIF Translation Fellowship. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rishwan. Thanks for having me.
Shefali, I think let's start with the most obvious question. The book you have selected for translating is Do Mulk Ek Kahani by Ibrahim Jalees, published in 1949. So, for all our listeners who don't know who he is, can you tell us who is Ibrahim Jalees?
Absolutely. Ibrahim Jalees is actually a I think he's under-researched, in generally in Urdu literature and criticism as well. But he's been a very important writer. He was from Hyderabad. The family was from Hyderabad, and that is how I first kind of came to know of his work because my doctoral research was on Hyderabad. But Ibrahim Jalees comes from a very fabled kind of family, right? They were from the Hyderabad, Karnataka, what used to be called Hyderabad, Karnataka region. And I think maybe our listeners, people who read Urdu or know of it, uh, may have come across his name, but his equally famous brother, the youngest brother, was Mujtaba Hussain, who was a satirist, very popular in Hyderabad as well. So Ibrahim Hussain Jalees, Jalees is kind of his pen name, but then it becomes so closely associated with him that, it just becomes his name. He was a very interesting writer in the sense that he started off by writing fiction, very influenced by the progressive writers, of the 1930s and 40s. And generally, when he began writing, his first short story collection was published when he was 23 years old. So he was considered a very, like a very promising talent. But by the end of his life, and he died kind of early in his 50s, very suddenly in Pakistan, he had more or less switched to, writing political columns, satire, so those kinds of genres, and didn't continue with fiction at all. So the text that I've chosen is a bit of a hinge text in his career as well, because it's non-fiction, it's a memoir, but it's also what is called in Urdu reportage. And it reports the events, the main kind of characters in the drama that unfolded in Hyderabad between August 1947 and September 1948, which was a very consequential year, as you know. Just after Indian independence and just around the time of the police action in Hyderabad. And Jalis played a big part in those events. He was very well placed to write this account. And so it's a very powerful account. And I think that I wrote in my proposal that it's a matter of surprise to me that no one has translated this into English yet. So I'm very happy to be the one to do it.
So one next thing I want to ask is that even though like it is the book is widely circulated when it was published and it is reprinted for three times after it appeared in 1949, what happens is this particular work is difficult to access when compared to subsequent works which Mr. Jalis wrote. So how did you come across this book in the first place?
Well, it's, anyone who's been to the University of Chicago Library will kind of feel this excitement with me, but it was in that library and it's an excellent resource for South Asian studies. A lot of texts which are very difficult to find elsewhere, which is kind of sad, our books should be better circulated on the subcontinent, but so that's where I found it. It's as you said, it became quite popular when it was published. So when it was well circulated on both sides of the border. But then it's been out of print for some time in Urdu. But in many of these things that were written about pieces of research on Hyderabad, it is referenced. So I followed the reference trail, and there it was in the library. So I was very grateful for that.
So, what was your initial reaction when you found the text?
I mean, it was really quite incredible. Like just the fact that, although I have to say, by that time I'd been at Chicago for some time, so you're spoiled. You kind of expect that any text you want will be there, and it was. So it was. But when I read it, because the genre, like I said, reportage, you expect a kind of journalistic report. But what I wasn't prepared for was really the first thing I read by Ibrahim Jalees, was the style and the texture of the book. It's really quite powerfully written, and it has many different moods, and it's not that long of a text, right? It's about 200 pages. But it has humor. It's a very savage satire. It has a lot of anger. There's heroism. There's also, it's tragic. There's self-recrimination. He's really looking back at the year that he spent in Hyderabad between 47 and 48, and he has a lot of complaints about his own kind of behavior and the way that his politics went in that year. So the book has, it's a very brave book in many ways, and it's also a very powerful piece of writing.
No, I want to discuss about some of the themes that you have spoken about the book. But before that, I think this book is as old as both India and Pakistan. It's more than 75 years old, and it wasn't read much outside the Urdu reading circles. So what does it feel like to be the person who is finally bringing it across to wider readership through your translation? And why did you decide to translate this book?
There's a very, very long answer to that question, but I will give you the short one. Obviously, this is a very exciting, even as I was writing the proposal for it, it's a very exciting task, but it is also nerve-wrackingly, hard. Because, as you said, part of it is that there's a new readership, which is not Urdu, and also it's been translated into Hindi very recently, and it has been translated into Marathi, which is interesting, also recently. So I think what's happened is there's renewed interest in the Deccan, in Hyderabad state, right, in the last 10 years or so. And a lot of new stuff is coming out of that, and which is, all to the good. So I think the new translations may be part of that. But to translate it into English, as you said, is a whole new challenge. So you have to translate at different levels because the debates in English are so different. The way that this book has to be mediated to an English readership, that's a challenge that I'm both looking forward to, because, that's the reason I picked this book to translate. And I'm also very aware of the challenges that kind of poses. So I think two reasons that I chose to translate this book. One, because, as I've said, it's a very singular kind of text, that there's not that many accounts of the history of Hyderabad, but not just the history of Hyderabad, the history of the subcontinent, as you said. And as the title says, right, it's the story of two nations. And he's talking about how there is one story to be told about both. And so, how he tells that story, I think, is important. It's an eyewitness account from a vantage point that you don't often see, which is, Hyderabad state. Um, that's one. And the second, I think, is also because I'm interested generally in literary studies, Urdu literature, etc. The reportage is a very interesting genre to me. And so I think Jalees is a very skilled practitioner of this genre. And so to translate it is also to kind of bring that genre across to a new readership. So that those are, I think, the two reasons that this book is important.
No, I mean, a couple of questions from what you have just said. It's a different kind of partition story. It's not the
Yeah.
story that is happening at the Indo-Pak borders, but it is something that is happening within the country, right? And like when we discuss about partition literature in English, especially Manto pops up, Isma Chugtai pops up, but Jalis was never in the conversation, right? And the kind of story he was telling is also never in the conversation. The lateral effects of the partition within Indian mainland.
Mhm.
So, what is it? What is the reason he was out of conversation in the English literary circles for a very long time? And is it because of the language? Is it because of the geography or the kind of writing? Because, as you said, it's mostly reportage and not fiction or not strict non-fiction. So, what is the main reason?
I think there may be a couple of reasons, historically speaking. So, yes, Manto and Ismat Chugtai, very rightfully, right? Like, I mean, their style is unique and incredible writers, and very well circulated for that reason. But as you said, fiction, right? And fiction of that kind, they have a very, singular kind of voice. And because even within the progressive writers fold, right, these were the kind of the brightest stars in some sense, right? But Hyderabadis, for example, will often complain that, the Urdu people, it's all very North centric, this Urdu literary culture, all the discussion, criticism, etc. And there's something to that, that the Deccan has remained a little understudied and undervalued. So I think part of the reason that people like Ibrahim Jalees, really, right, have remained kind of out of the mainstream circulation of these stories around partition is because of that, right? That he's writing from an unconventional. Um, I don't want to say marginal because there's quite a, it's quite a live scene of Urdu literature, but it's not well circulated. But the other reason may be that Jalees's career, took him very rapidly from fiction to non-fiction. And in general, I think the non-fiction genres of Urdu have not got as much attention as they should have got. So even when we think about Urdu literature, first, the most discussed is actually poetry, right? And again, for good reason, it's great poetry. And then you have the short story, you have novels, and the big Puratul and Heather, etc., right? The big novelists. But other stuff like reportage or memoir, even, I think is just starting to, get some kind of attention. So I think that may also be a reason. And finally, when we think of partition, we don't think of the South, right? We think of the border, as you said. Um, but again, I think that's changing. That the story of the subcontinent is really subcontinent wide, right? Is starting to be recognized that it has had repercussions throughout. And so this, in fact, makes it a good moment for me to, take up this task.
Yeah, I mean, one more question which I want to ask again from what we have already discussed is the title of this book, right? Which is actually very simple, Do Mulk Ek Kahani, right? That you translate it as Two Nations and One Story, right? So, what is that story? Is it a story of a shared loss? It is a story of a failure of imagination. So, what is that story that he's talking about?
I think so. The story he's trying to tell is, in one sense, familiar, in the sense that it's the story of someone who's caught in a larger historical moment, not of his own making, right? And he sees that as a common thing, right, across borders. That really 47, 48 is that kind of story. It's tragic, um, but it has its comic moments as well. But mostly that one has this feeling of being swept along, um, right, in events over which one has no control. Um, so that's but the other part of it, I think, and that's what makes this, as I said earlier, this book has many textures, right? Is the importance of individual relationships that keep one kind of grounded, right? That you need your friends, you need people who have known you as a person, right? And so while these large historical events are playing out, right, the one story is of these individuals who are trying to find their way with the help of other people, that you will not succeed, or you will, that if the ethical life, if you like, of the individual is impossible without those friendships and, what you've built. And I think that is also a story that he sees in the subcontinent has in common in some ways.
I mean, speaking more about Jalis himself, in your proposal, you have mentioned how Jalis's youngest brother, who is the late humorist Mujtaba Hussain, has described Jalis as, and I quote, showed a great deal of haste in all his actions. It was as if he had not had blood, but mercury in his veins. Stop quote. So, how is this coming out in his writings, and what is his anger about?
So he was, it's this is something that Mujtaba Hussain would repeat a lot about his brother, and I think there's a note of complaint there also because the brothers had, I think there were 12 years between them, and really after Jalis migrates, Mujtaba Hussain, I think, met him only once, right? So it's also the story of this family, which is he doesn't get to spend as much time as he would have liked with this brother. So he has these memories from childhood, um, but Jellies moves very quickly through, as I said, like when he's in his 20s, he's already written these short stories as a student, more or less. He gets into film writing. There are scripts, in Bombay because he's friends with all these people, Zahid Ludhianvi, Ibn Insha, etc. But he doesn't like it, right? So he leaves that and he comes back to Hyderabad.
Like, I mean, talking about the narrative of this book, actually, the narrative of this book takes us through his last year in Hyderabad state. And it goes through about author's flight from Hyderabad in September
Yeah.
1948 to Pakistan when he arrived there, and then starting a new life there. So, what are the key ideas, ideologies, influences that Jalis goes through in this period from his fight against Indian state in Hyderabad to finally flying to Pakistan and starting a new life there? What are the key influences in this particular time period?
So this again is connected to the, his quicksilver kind of temperament, right? And he writes about it that way himself because this is also a piece of self-criticism, do Mulk Kahani, where he writes about his left politics, his leanings, in that direction. He's a very, very, by this time, recognized young progressive writer. But then the violence of partition, right, and the way that it's reported in the press, um, he is so deeply affected by that that he feels that he has to go over to the Ittehad al-Muslimin, which is, the opposite of the left. They are kind of the Hyderabad right wing, if you like, at this point. And he does it. He takes up this mantle, of propaganda. And he does this very consistently. He writes speeches. He writes uh, you know. uh, journal articles, and he becomes very notorious for his kind of attacks, against the Indian Union and that kind of politics. And he is very honest in, reporting all of these things in the aftermath of this, right? And then as soon as the fall of Hyderabad state, as it's called in the literature, he suddenly, that it's an entire world that collapses, right, for many people. And then he's forced to escape. So that is a crucial kind of point in the story, right? Where he's able to suddenly see um, where he kind of admits that he's gone wrong, and what that means for him as a writer and as a person who's committed to the public cause, as someone who's passionate about these things. Um, but then once he gets to Pakistan, again, this is why I spoke about friendships, right? That there are these people who have not given up on him, right? That they see that it's his temperament, which is very quick, and that they make space for him again, and they kind of accept him back, and he finds some support, etc. And then he's able to look back on this moment in his life from that vantage point, right, where there's a new country being built again, the whole question of the working person, the working class, peasantry. What is that politics going to be like? Because there's a Communist Party of Pakistan, and there's already kind of agitations happening and demonstrations. So he's able to pick up the pieces because of the kind of support he receives in Pakistan as well. And he's able then to put this story together. And in some ways, in the same piece, Mujtaba Hussain also says that he's able to put himself back together through this book. So it's that way it's a book that becomes important for him, and none of his other writing has the same quality because of these reasons.
No, that is interesting. As you said, there's a great honesty also about this work because very rarely people write that, okay, I fought against India from the state of Hyderabad. Like that's I think a very unique perspective, at least for me. Next thing I want to talk about is in the very beginning you have mentioned how this book has a lot of humor and also satire in it, and seems like it's a very serious book. How did these two has come in it?
Well, the fun thing is, so in my doctoral research, right, that was a study of politics in the current moment in Hyderabad, right? And one things that has struck me is this quality of humor, right, that Hyderabadis bring to any situation, right? I mean, even the most serious, otherwise serious, and it could be near disaster, but there's always this sense of sometimes it's cynical humor, but they always find a way, to not trivialize, but there's a quality of, life goes on in that sense, that I find to be very kind of unique to Hyderabad. And I see Jalees's writing as kind of an example of that. So the funniest parts are when he's writing about politics, actually, in Hyderabad, right? The kind of things that go on, the corruption of the regime, the way that posts are being decided and distributed in 1947, 48, Hyderabad, the kind of deals that are being made, and the way that Hyderabadis gossip about all of these people who are supposed to be leading them, right? It is also very contemporary, right? It's the way you cope with, again, power that is being exercised by people whom you really don't have much control over. So what do? You crack jokes. There are these, there's gossip, etc. And he has a very keen eye for absurdity. So he's able to write all of this down, and it's really quite, um, it's very Hyderabadi in that sense.
I mean, that in itself is an act of resistance. We can see it as such, right? The kind of coping through humor. Shifali, like now talking about your work. So this is the first book-length translation of yours from Urdu to English. So how did you develop the interest in translation? And in general, why do you think the translation as such matter?
This is a really large question, right? So I think there are two answers to this. One, as a reader, right? That um, one has grown up reading translations, really, right? In a sense, everything we read in English, right, for us is reading translation, right? Because we don't, we grow up with different languages, but then we all learn to kind of enjoy or read different kinds of things in English. And I also belong, I think mine must be the last generation to have read those wonderful children's books that used to come from Soviet Russia, right? Like they were just beautifully produced in different languages, right? But English was one of them. They had beautiful stuff in Hindi, right? So now when I look back, I see that, the Ukrainian folk tales or, like the stories of the folk tales from Russia or whatever, we read them in Hindi, we read them in English, right? And they were very well produced. They were some of the best books for children to be had in the 80s, right? So in a way, translation has shaped all of us, right? All of our reading, the world kind of opens up for you in translation. So that's something it took a while to recognize. But if you think about it, right, it's that kind of but so that's as a reader, I recognize that about, and you can tell a good translation from a bad translation. You always get a glimpse of another language, right? So I still remember how in the Hindi translations of the Russian stories, there would always be this character called the Tsar, right? And it would be J with a dot under it, right? The Urdu. And I had no idea what a czar was, right? As a child. So, but after reading all of these books, I was like, oh, it's like a king, And so there's Russian history that you suddenly kind of, when stuff falls into place. So that's one. But second, also as someone who went on to do literary studies, right? And I've taught courses which have to do with translation, right? And thought about translation as an activity. Um, it's something that is common to a lot of so not just literary people, but anthropology is, what I identify with as a discipline now. And anthropologists think about translation all the time because we're talking about translating cultures, right? Bringing one culture to another, etc. And the difficulties of that, where you should stop and not translate, right? So all of these questions come up and more, we're living in a world where people, it's ironic that, the more it has opened up, the more kind of insular people seem to want to be, right? Kind of, no, my culture is best or whatever, right? And I think that translation becomes even more important in a time like ours when you have to recognize the kind of just the way it shapes the world and the way you look at the world.
Now, one thing that you said is interesting, right? We also have to know where to stop translating, right? Because some things are simply not possible to be translated. So I think that's my next question is about. So when you look at some specific idioms are very specific to Urdu itself. It is quite challenging to translate them into English. So what kind of strategy are you putting in place to translate and carry that idiom from one language to another language from in this case Urdu to English?
Well, there's not, I feel like I don't have a strategy, right? I feel like I will have to have different tactics in some sense because it will depend on, I think the text. is something that I'm expecting to lead me right into this. And so a lot of the work that I'm going to do also here is to read other. I've read other things that Jalees has written, but there's more just to get into the way that he uses the language, right? And so that's something that'll be part of what I bring to the translation. But also there are Urdu, has always been a language, I mean, being a modern language, right? It was formed in the crucible of global interaction, right, more or less. So they've had no problem kind of just importing words from others. So, for example, even the word reportage, it's written as reportage, right? That's the genre in Urdu. Um, it's an Urdu word now, right? So it's a very it has this traffic with other languages, European languages, other Indian languages, which I want to also kind of keep alive in the translation. So I think there is the challenge is to avoid exoticism, right? Um, to not just leave words in there for their mystery or, for the heck of it, so that people, when they read, they can say, oh, wow, Urdu is so beautiful or whatever, right? Because it's also very, um, it kind of puts the language in a box, right? But also to kind of convey the difference that it makes, and to actually make it like a window into a different world. And I think that's as we go along, I guess, I will have to adopt different ways of doing this. So what I've already, kind of begun to do is sometimes I gloss in English. Some of these terms, especially, terms used for royalty, for example. But what's much harder to do, right, is translate register, right? So, for example, famously in English, um, you don't have the respectful versus, the ordinary you. It's you for everything, right? Whereas in a lot of Indian languages, there's a difference between, and in many European languages, right? You can, the second person, right, will convey aap or tum or tu, which will convey status and what kind of thing is going on. So that idiom has to be translated differently in English, and it will depart from, in some ways, from what's on the page in the Urdu. So those are things that, again, that make translating exciting, and to have to grapple with those questions is something I'm actually also looking forward to doing.
And one more question about the language itself now, because of the partition, the fate of Urdu language in India has completely changed, right? It's a language that is pushed to margin. It is associated with Pakistan. The language is treated with suspicion, right? And now, because of this, all reasons, many Urdu texts go untranslated. And if something goes untranslated, something is actually disappearing from the record, right? A possibility of a perspective, a possibility of a new story, a possibility of a narrative, right? So now, what happens when things go untranslated because of certain reasons, like what we have discussed about Urdu? And what is it that specifically disappears if Jalis stays out of English conversations about partition?
That's a great question, Rishwant. I think so. First of all, your question is kind of based on, the reality of our world, which is that English is kind of the language of record, right? That if one is not able to access something in English, right, it is at risk of disappearing, right? So that's something that in itself should kind of give us pause. But I think what English readers are missing if, they don't read someone like Jalise is a very kind of first of all, I mean, as we've said, historically, the vantage point of the Deccan in the whole history of the subcontinent is only starting to emerge. So that would be one thing. But his is also a very particular voice. And as I said, it's a very brave book to have written. Um, it's not everybody who can write something like this with such honesty. And it feels contemporary because I think today, and this is something that I think a lot of people are worrying about who write about politics, right? And it's almost always a complaint or a lament in some ways that people are taking all of this, there's a lot of emotion in politics that um, friendships and families are kind of at loggerheads because of political beliefs or passion or whatever, right? That what we need is more reason and more kind of reasonable behavior on all sides, etc., right? But the reason we all find politics so compelling is because it is full of passion, right? That it kind of gets to the root of who you are, it excites your imagination, etc. And someone like Jalees is very good at writing about that, right? That what can happen when the best part of you, right? Commitment, passion, right? The belief that you have in a larger public good, um, is channeled in a direction which you really had not even anticipated or you can't control. And then you have to regret when you look back at it, right? So I think that's something that very few people have written about with as much clarity and courage as Jellies has brought to his text. So I think in that sense, it's kind of a text for our times. And I hope it will speak to people as that.
Shifali, one more question. I think you have already addressed this a bit, which is about the fact that this is a very politically charged text, and Jalis is a very recognized author in Pakistan, right? To an extent, that in August 1989, 12 years after his death, the government of Pakistan awarded Ibrahim Jalees a posthumous Medal of Merit in recognition to his services, right? So, does this context in any way will affect what this translation means to you personally?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I am treating Ibrahim Jalees as a Hyderabadi, right? And yeah, I understand that could be problematic for many reasons, especially, yeah, given his fame and his position in Pakistan. Really, that is where he made his career. And it was his home. But he also always had a soft spot for Hyderabad. It is kind of his city in some sense, even though, his education was at Aligarh, all of that. And he moved around quite a bit. He was, as his brother says, a restless kind of soul. But as I said, I see him, especially with this text, right, as someone who comes from Hyderabad and a very particular Hyderabad milieu, and is kind of responding to that. So, in some ways, this is also a book that would not be possible without, you know, um, the social and political context of Hyderabad. So, and a lot of the work that's been done on his work, I mean, there's not a lot, but people who've written about him are Hyderabad based. So it's also, that is what is of interest to me also, right? That to be accountable in some sense to the Hyderabad milieu of this text and of Jalisa as being rooted in that milieu. So sorry to the Pakistani literary establishment, but yeah, I mean that's the way I'm approaching it.
That's lovely. But thank you so much, Shefali, and for your candid answers. And we look forward to read the book soon.
Thank you so much, Rishwant, for asking these really sharp questions. And yeah, I look forward to more interaction and definitely, yeah, putting the book out for people to read.
Thank you.